and we'll go ahead and get things going. Welcome again, 21 Senior Experience Seminar Series. It's Thursday today. We've got one more tomorrow at 4 p.m. and then 3 more next week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, also at 4 o'clock. So please do join for any and or all of those. With that introduction, I'd like to have Stefan introduce today's speaker, Jojo Maier.
It is my pleasure to introduce Jojo Maier. Is coming to us from the great state of Oregon, biochemistry major, and we've had lots of great discussions about this talk. This is one of those multi-week things where he and I have sat down and just kind of said, well, what question do we want to ask? And the talk has kind of took various twists and turns over those months, and it's been kind of neat to really push Jojo to follow that path wherever it lies to the most sort of interesting point. So it's been really cool to really take a pretty broad survey, not only of sort of medicine, but of medicinal chemistry, and understanding how small changes in molecular structure can make a pretty big difference, not just in terms of sort of fitting into some active site, but in a pharmacokinetic sense as well, just making it more drug-like. And so I'm really excited to see kind of where this long path has ended up. So without further ado, Jojo, take it away.
Awesome, thank you. Okay. So today I will be talking about ergot alkaloids, specifically their history and medicinal applications. So it's not very hard to imagine an epidemic these days. I mean, we're living in a pandemic at the moment ourselves, but imagine a slightly different type of epidemic, one where there isn't a known pathogen traveling around causing illness and disease, but rather, for some unknown reason, people are coming down with some very strange symptoms. Some people are coming down with convulsions and delusions and hallucinations. Other people are having severe bouts of nausea and vomiting. But perhaps the most strange symptom is what people are terming St. Anthony's Holy Fire, where basically people feel as though their entire body is burning up and on fire. And people who experience these symptoms are also finding that eventually their limbs are drying up and falling off. But nobody knows what is causing these symptoms. All they know is that this just keeps happening, especially during times of famine. This is the type of epidemic that plagued people throughout all of Europe in the Middle Ages. And as it turned out, this epidemic was caused by ergot poisoning, or ergotism. This was caused by eating contaminated rye crops. Basically what happened was during times of famine, people were slightly less picky about what they ate. And so they weren't as careful about filtering off all of the extra growth on the rye crops. And they didn't know better. They didn't know that ergot was causing poisoning. And so they were consuming this fungus ergot. So what exactly is this fungus ergot? Well, ergot is a fungus that contains these metabolites called ergot alkaloids that are metabolically active. And ergot comes from the family Clavicus purprea. The ergot alkaloids that are found in ergot are found in the sclerotium of the fungus, which is underneath the stroma. And you can see here, this is what ergot growing on rye looks like. Ergot alkaloids have 4 main groups: ergopeptams, clavine alkaloids, ergopeptines, and lysergic acid derivatives. For this talk, I will mostly be talking about lysergic acid derivatives, which have a structure like this, where the hydroxy group here can be any R group, and ergopeptines, which have this type of structure, where these 2 R groups can be any amino acid substituent. The main defining feature of the ergoalkaloids is this ergoline ring that is present in all ergoalkaloids, and this is what gives it its metabolic properties. The reason for this is because the ergoline nucleus that is found in all ergoalkaloids has a structure that is similar to the neurotransmitters dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline. Due to the similarity in structure, the ergoalkaloids target the receptors for these neurotransmitters. So I just said that the ergoalkaloids target the cellular receptors for the neurotransmitters dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline. But what is a cell receptor? Receptors are proteins that are found on or within cells that bind to a molecule and initiate a cellular response. Basically, what happens is the molecule, termed a ligand, binds to the receptor membrane, and that initiates some type of intracellular response that causes and impacts many physiological processes. Ergoalkaloids bind to a specific type of cellular receptor called a GPCR, or G protein coupled receptor. Basically, how these receptors work is that they have two forms, an activated state and an inactivated state. In an inactivated state, GDP is bound to the receptor. In an active state, GTP is bound to the receptor. Basically, how it works is a ligand, such as adrenaline pictured here, or any other ligand, such as serotonin or dopamine or noradrenaline, binds to the receptor, and that activates it, causing GDP to be exchanged for GTP. Once the receptor has been activated, this causes a single cascade where a secondary messenger, such as cyclic AMP, is activated, and this impacts a bunch of variety of physiological processes. Two other helpful terms to understand are agonist and antagonist. An agonist is the chemical that binds to a receptor and activates it to produce a biological response. And an antagonist is a chemical that binds to a receptor and blocks the activation of that receptor. Ergoalkaloids can be both agonists and antagonists, depending on which ergoalkaloid you're talking about and which receptors you're talking about. For instance, bromocriptine is a D2 dopamine agonist. That means that when it binds to the dopamine receptors, it activates that receptor and causes more of a response. Dihydroergocornine, on the other hand, is a serotonin antagonist. That means that when dihydroergocornine binds to the serotonin receptor, it blocks the activation of that receptor. Basically, ergotism that was plaguing people throughout all of the Middle Ages is caused by the agonist properties of ergoalkaloids that was resulting in an overstimulation of the receptors dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin. Specifically, the symptoms of nausea and vomiting are caused by overstimulation of the D2 dopamine receptors, and the burning pain that was experienced is caused by overstimulation of the alpha-androgenic receptors. And that very strange symptom that people were having with their limbs drying up and falling off, well, that's actually caused by vasoconstriction, which is when the veins and arteries become constricted, blocking off blood flow. So the limbs and extremities weren't getting enough blood flow, and that was what was causing them to dry up and fall off. That is caused by the agonist property by being 5-HT serotonin and alpha-androgenic agonists, and so those receptors were being overstimulated. Finally, the psychological effects that are caused and seen in ergotism are caused by overstimulation of the dopamine and serotonin receptors. Now, it might be interesting to note that the ergoalkaloid, ergotamine, happens to be a precursor to another famous drug that's not an ergoalkaloid itself, but is related, and that is lysergic acid diethylamine, or LSD. And LSD causes many of the same symptoms as ergotism does, specifically the hallucinations and delusions, and also the nausea and vomiting. Sometimes people have theorized that during the Middle Ages, people were actually consuming small amounts of LSD by mistake, and that was what was causing some of the symptoms. Also, some people have wondered whether they can simply take ergot to cause some of the same effects as LSD without having to synthesize the drug. However, it's important to remember that ergot is poisonous and can cause death. So it's highly unadvisable to choose to experiment with ergot to seek pleasurable symptoms, because there are very negative symptoms that you will likely also experience. So while ergot was busy causing all of this havoc in the Middle Ages, it also has proved to be quite beneficial. And that's because while ergot alkaloids can be toxic in high amounts, small amounts can have medicinal properties. Ergot was actually used in medicine quite early on, as early as 1100 BCE in China. It was originally used as an aid in childbirth to help quicken it. And later on, in the 17 and 1800s, once ergot had been discovered and people realized that it was ergot causing ergotism, they started to investigate with other uses of ergot. And they found this property with it being helpful in childbirth. Doctors actually began to prescribe ergot, and then they started beginning to do clinical trials to see how effective this was and whether there were any side effects. It's probably a good thing that they checked for side effects, because it turns out that not only were pregnant women coming down with ergotism when they were given ergot to help quicken childbirth, but it was also one of the leading causes for stillbirth and maternal death. So by the end of the 19th century, the use of ergot to help quicken childbirth was essentially abolished. That being said, one ergot alkaloid, ergotamine, is still used in the childbirth process. However, it's used after the childbirth has actually taken place and to treat postpartum hemorrhages. Now, you may be wondering how it is that ergot alkaloids work to quicken childbirth and why ergotamine can help treat postpartum hemorrhages. Well, that's because ergotamine is a 5-HT2 and beta-androgen receptor agonist, and stimulation of those receptors causes an increase in uterine contractions, which helps expel the child or placenta more quickly, and also helps heal postpartum hemorrhages more quickly as well. Another use for ergot alkaloids in medicine is to treat migraines. The ergot alkaloids ergotamine, dihydroergotamine, and Methylsergide are used to treat migraines, and they work in a mechanism similar to how ergotamine works. They also are agonists to the serotonin and androgen receptors, but they are specifically agonists for the 5-HT2 serotonin receptors, not just the 5-HT1, and for the alpha androgen receptors and not the beta androgen receptors. The result of stimulating these receptors is vasoconstriction, which is what helps treat the migraine. Now, it might be confusing how vasoconstriction helps treat migraines, because you'd think that would cut off the blood flow to the brain. But actually, during a migraine, the arteries in the brain become dilated, and that causes an increase in pressure, which results in pain. So that's why people experience these feelings of pressure and pain when they have a migraine. Administration of an ergot alkaloid, such as ergotamine or dihydroergotamine, causes the arteries to constrict to a more normal size, reducing those symptoms of pressure and pain. However, ergotamine and dihydroergotamine are not only agonists for the 5-HT2 receptors and alpha androgen receptors, but they also are partial D2 dopamine agonists, and this results in some side effects such as nausea and vomiting that can make ergotamine and dihydroergotamine dose limiting. Also, higher amounts of these drugs can result in ergotism. So while small amounts can be medicinally useful, once again, we see problems when too much is given. So I just mentioned that ergotamine and dihydroergotamine target D2 dopamine receptors, and that causes some of the side effects. Many ergot alkaloids target dopamine receptors, and to better understand how they work on targeting dopamine receptors, it's helpful to understand what type of dopamine receptors exist. There are two types of dopamine receptors: D1-like receptors, which include D1 and D5 dopamine, and activation of these receptors causes an increase in cyclic AMP production. There's also D2-like dopamine receptors, which includes D2, D3, and D4 dopamine receptors. Activation of these receptors inhibits cyclic AMP production. It's also helpful to understand which physiological processes these receptors impact. Each one's impact different processes. D1 dopamine impacts locomotion, memory, impulse control, and attention, while D2 dopamine receptors influence sleep, locomotion, attention, and learning. D3, D4, and D5 also impact a number of functions, but ergot alkaloids tend to target these receptors less, so I'm not going to really talk about them. A number of ergot alkaloids are specifically used for their dopamine agonist properties, but they each bind to dopamine and activate dopamine receptors in slightly different ways. Nicergoline and bromocriptine are both similar in that they are both D2 dopamine agonists, and they have similar potencies, meaning they bind just as strongly as each other to D2 dopamine receptors. Bromocriptine, however, also happens to be a D1 dopamine antagonist and a D3 dopamine agonist. Cabergoline is a D2 dopamine agonist, but it is much stronger and more potent than Nicergoline or bromocriptine. This means that less cabergoline can be used to produce the same amount of effects, and it also has a slightly lesser side effect profile. Ergoloid can be useful because it targets both D1 and D2 dopamine receptors. It is an agonist for both. This can be especially helpful when trying to target movement disorders because both D1 and D2 dopamine receptors influence locomotion. This is especially helpful when treating Parkinson's disease. In Parkinson's disease, the substantial niagara of the neurons are degenerated and they don't produce enough dopamine. So oftentimes people treat Parkinson's disease with dopamine agonists so that the dopamine receptors become more sensitive to the small amounts of dopamine that is being produced. All of the dopamine agonists that I just mentioned are used to treat Parkinson's disease. Another use for dopamine agonists is to help treat hyperprolactinemia. Hyperprolactinemia is characterized by too much prolactin production, which can result in symptoms such as infertility, breast lactation, and hypogonadism. Basically, how it works is dopamine production inhibits prolactin production, and so by stimulating the dopamine receptors, they help reduce the amount of prolactin that is being reduced, which is the main issue in the condition. A very unique use for ergot alkaloids is bromocriptine, and it's used to help treat type 2 diabetes. Bromocriptine is the only ergot alkaloid that is used to treat type 2 diabetes and is also the only dopamine targeting drug that is used to treat type 2 diabetes. The mechanism for how bromocriptine is working to treat type 2 diabetes is not fully understood, but there are many theories behind it. One of the theories is that by being a dopamine agonist, it is somehow influencing the circadian rhythm. This is part of the reason why bromocriptine gets its brand name Cyclocet. Basically, by administering bromocriptine early in the morning, they cause an early morning release of dopamine, which resets the person's circadian rhythm. The idea behind this came from observing animals in the wild during hibernation. During hibernation, animals tend to put on weight and become more insulin resistant and develop many similarities to the profile of people with type 2 diabetes. People began to speculate that by adjusting the circadian rhythm of people with type 2 diabetes and getting them out of this somewhat hibernation-like state, they can somehow reduce the whole pathology behind type 2 diabetes. Another idea behind how dopamine may be working to help treat type 2 diabetes is how dopamine influences cyclic AMP production. Bromocriptine is both a D2 dopamine agonist and a D1 dopamine antagonist, and both of those aspects result in a decrease in cyclic AMP production. This is helpful because decreasing cyclic AMP production also results in a decreased amount of hepatic gluconeogenesis, which lowers the amount of sugar being produced, and also it helps decrease liponeogenesis, which is the formation of free fatty acids. It just so happens to be that bromocriptine lowers blood sugar levels and also lowers free fatty acid levels. This is also helpful because it helps decrease adverse cardiovascular disease, which is a common comorbid to type 2 diabetes. So it also can be protective of the heart. Another theory behind how bromocriptine may be working is that it may be targeting not only the D2 dopamine receptors, but also the alpha-adrenergic receptors that are found in the pancreas that are found in pancreatic cells. This helps influence insulin secretion and insulin sensitivity. To better understand why this might be important, it's helpful to understand what's going on in diabetes. Basically, in a healthy person, the pancreas releases insulin, and that insulin binds to an insulin receptor on a cell, and that essentially unlocks the cell, allowing glucose to get in and lowering blood glucose levels. In type 1 diabetes, which bromocriptine does not treat, the issue is that the pancreas is not producing enough insulin. So with no insulin being produced, there's no insulin to bind to the receptor, and the cell can't be unlocked, resulting in glucose remaining in the bloodstream and high blood glucose levels. Treatment is simply providing insulin injections to unlock the cells. In type 2 diabetes, there's a slightly different issue. The pancreas is still producing insulin, and oftentimes it's actually overproducing insulin. Instead, the issue is that the insulin receptor is not sensitive to the insulin being produced. And so even though insulin is present, it's not binding to the receptor, and glucose isn't able to get into the cell. So this is resulting in, once again, high blood glucose levels. By administering bromocriptine and making those insulin receptors more sensitive, that is making it so the insulin can now bind to the receptor, and glucose can get into the cell, and blood glucose levels are going to be lowered. So while the whole mechanism behind bromocriptine and how it's working is still somewhat up for debate and is still being researched to this day, we still know that it works. Clinical trials have shown that bromocriptine is just as effective as other anti-diabetic drugs in treating type 2 diabetes. That is not exactly the case with some other uses for ergot alkaloids. The ergot alkaloids Nicergoline, Ergoloid Mesylates, and Dihydroergocornine are thought to be neuroprotective and have been used to try to treat Alzheimer's and dementia. However, the mechanism of how they might be working is unknown, though Nicergoline has been theorized to stimulate the PI3K-RAC alpha-AKT signaling pathway, which helps protect neurons against apoptosis, which is cell death. So if this drug is helping prevent cells from dying, it can be neuroprotective. That being said, once these drugs were brought to clinical trials, they found that they had very little effect, if any. And so while they are FDA approved to treat Alzheimer's and dementia, they may not really be your best options. Even more research is being done on further uses for ergot alkaloids. Ergot alkaloids have found potential for use in cancer. These studies are quite recent and have only been done in vitro, but they have shown that ergopeptines have potential for causing cell death and apoptosis in cancer cell lines. This is exactly what you want in a cancer-treating drug because you want to kill the cancer cells. Similarly, dihydroergocristine has been shown to impact the nuclear factor kappa light chain enhancers of activated B cells, and this helps impede cancer progression. Still, these studies are quite recent, such as 2017 and 2020, and we have yet to do any studies in even animal models, much less humans, so we don't know quite yet whether ergot alkaloids will actually be effective in treating cancer. Long and short, ergot alkaloids have been extremely impactful in history, and their importance in medicine has continued to this day. Ergot alkaloids have shown to be beneficial in treating migraines, Parkinson's disease, hyperprolactinemia, diabetes, and they may even have potential for treatment in cancer. I hope you enjoyed learning as much about ergot alkaloids and some of their medicinal properties as I did. I would like to thank some people who helped make this presentation possible, specifically Stefan Debert, who served as my advisor and really helped me get interested in this subject, Rachel Dowdy and Graham Suzama, who helped me prepare for this presentation, my classmates, Cho, Lindsay, and Aaron, who helped me prepare these slides and gave me feedback on this presentation, and all of my biology and chemistry professors at Lawrence, who gave me the background needed to better understand this subject. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Yay.
Yay. Okay, floor is open.
All right. Jojo, if you don't mind going back real quick to the slide on Parkinson's and just kind of give me a brief rundown again there. I have a dear friend who suffers from Parkinson's, and it was kind of like, whoa, wait a minute, okay? So the Ergo is working on how is this working here? One more time.
So basically, the neurons in the brain aren't producing enough dopamine. And this means that all of the functions of dopamine aren't happening. So probably the most common one is like you see people with Parkinson's disease having slowed movements. And that's because D1 and D2 dopamine receptors influence locomotion. So one of the features is that it helps like speed up movements. It also has impacts on digestion. So it can also often cause slow motility, especially in the colon, which will result in constipation. There are, of course, like issues with like memory and attention, sleep, all of those things, all of the things that dopamine influences because there's not being enough dopamine being produced are going to be influenced with Parkinson's disease.
So are Ergo products being used in treating Parkinson's, or is this still in research?
Oh no, this is one of the earliest uses for ergot alkaloids.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, they're used in the beginning stages when some dopamine is still being produced, just to make the receptors more sensitive to the dopamine that is being produced. Okay. After a while, L-Dopa, which is synthetic dopamine, begins being prescribed, and often that's prescribed in conjunction with the other ergot alkaloids, so that not only are the cells being given dopamine, but the cells are also going to be more sensitive to it, so less L-Dopa needs to be prescribed. There can be issues with L-Dopa causing issues with like tardive dyskinesia, so they don't want to prescribe too much of it.
Wait, what's that word?
Tardive dyskinesia. It's like involuntary tics.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks. So it sounds like the Ergo products are more for the early stages of the disease and then less used as it progresses. Well, that's bad news for my friend. Okay, thank you, Jojo.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions?
About how many of these ergoalkaloids are naturally found versus synthetically derived?
So like bromocriptine is synthetic, ergotamine is natural, dihydroergotamine is not natural, ergotamine is natural. I I don't know exactly on all of them. There's so many ergoalkaloids, it's kind of insane. I'm gonna guess like half and half. People keep producing all of these more synthetic ones to like narrow in on like which receptors they're going to target, so they don't have off-target like effects. But yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, for the most part, if there's anything simple about it, it must be synthetic, because you know the natural products here are just these stained glass windows of complexity. So I guess maybe you talked about this a little bit, but to bring you back, like what's kind of special about bromocriptine? It's unusual in that it has a bromine, which is not a whole lot of actual, the pharmacopoeia doesn't have a whole lot of big halides like that. So what's special about it?
Yeah, so bromocriptine is actually just ergocriptine with a bromine right here. And this is a picture of it binding to the dopamine receptor. And so I don't know that much about it, but it's like bromine, as you said, bromine is just not seen very often in medicine. It's a kind of bulky, big drug. So one thing Stefan and I were looking at was whether we could somehow modify this structure to see if it could bind more strongly to the dopamine receptors. And we didn't get that far because we weren't able to really do like any in-lab testing, but we thought we could add like a chain in over here instead.
Right. Those of you that remember your palladium chemistry from Ergo 1, right? That bromine looks a lot like a handle, right? So it's kind of cool.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, please.
Do you know of any are there like do you know of any negative side effects to using bromocriptine?
Nausea and vomiting is the main one that I know of. There haven't been studies on this, but due to dopamine agonists, which bromocriptine is, can cause delayed gastric emptying. And so that's likely part of the reason why it causes the nausea and vomiting. That's slightly problematic because sometimes people with diabetes often have delayed gastric emptying to begin with. And there can be some cardiovascular effects because bromocriptine also does target somewhat some serotonin receptors.
But we're less worried about St. Anthony's holy fire at this point, right?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to cause ergotism.
Okay, which is, I call it for a band name, trademark. Okay.
Oh, it also causes high blood pressure sometimes because of the serotonin receptors. Sorry.
Oh, I was wondering, so some of these drugs, I guess if you took too much of them, you could get like the ergot poisoning. Is like natural ergot poisoning still prevalent at all today, or has that been like kind of gotten rid of that?
I think it's been pretty much gotten rid of because people are filtering rye and they're not just like, rye is the main crop that it grows on. So they just know to avoid it. Most people aren't just like picking up rye crops, eating it, especially because it is quite visible that this fungus is growing on it. People just didn't know better than to not consume it.
Right. I just want to volunteer bromocriptine as a name for a band. Okay.
I mean, it's no St. Anthony's holy fire, but
right. No, but I love that name. All right.
Jojo, how did you come on this topic? How did you start thinking about ergot alkaloids?
It's a really weird story. It is so like does not make sense. Basically, last year I took medicinal chemistry with Stefan, and I was assigned phenylketonuria.
Right.
And one of the treatments for this is this coenzyme tetrahydrobutyrin, which is the coenzyme for the phenylalanine hydroxylase reaction, but also a coenzyme for nitric oxide synthase. I was interested in other effects of like how this drug could be used. And so I was looking at nitric oxide synthase and how it affects a number of diseases. I started looking at how nitric oxide synthase is involved in diabetes, and then specifically began looking up how different diabetic medications worked for influencing nitric oxide synthase. And I found that most of them increase nitric oxide production, but bromocriptine actually inhibits nitric oxide synthase. And so I started wondering why it was that it worked, and also whether there was a way, because you don't really want to inhibit nitric oxide synthase if you have diabetes, like that isn't always the best idea. So that was where the idea first came from, of like modifying the structure so that maybe it wouldn't have that effect. And I started looking at kind of ergoalkaloids more generally to get a better idea of what parts of the structure was causing the effects of bromocriptine.
That's cool. That story has as much of a cascade effect as all of these different pathways that you're talking about biochemically. That's great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, again, let's thank our speaker for very nice trot and some cool molecules. Graham, what's next on the schedule?
It's tomorrow at 4 p.m. and I'm sorry I don't have my schedule in front of me. Here, I can look it up.
Oh, it's
Rachel.
Natalie.
It's Natalie.
Natalie.
4 o'clock.
All right.